Thank you, George. Good evening and welcome to the Village of Monroe's Drinking Water Source Protection Program presentation. I thank you all for attending. If we can all stand for the pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. And thank you and welcome for this evening's attendance. Behind you, you have your exit door marked. You also have one off to my left here. I'd just like to open up with a little bit of a comment, and then I'm going to pass up the baton over to our consultants. So I just want everybody to know that we've spent about a year working on this project. We've had many stakeholders who were involved in this, and it took about a year to bring us to where we are this evening. We have about 75 minutes to do this. Following our meeting, the town board has their regularly scheduled meeting, so I want to be respectful to that. So my comments, Trustee Carl will make a few of his own, and then we're going to pass this off to the consultants. After that, we're going to have a Q&A that we're glad to have. I'm going to ask everyone in the audience that if they have a question regarding this document, we're welcome to have you come up tonight. Anything else, any other matters regarding the lake or the use of the lake or anything like that, tomorrow night is our regularly scheduled Village Board of Trustees meeting, and I welcome you all to come into that meeting, both for the public hearing, at which time you'll be able to speak about it and ask questions, and then as well later on in the public comment. So it's very important that we be able to get this presentation done and the Q&A for any questions regarding this and this only in 75 minutes before we hand it back over to the town. I thank the town for allowing us to use this space. In the Village Hall, we have about 1/10 of the space, so it's really great that we have this opportunity. Just real quickly, I just want to describe for you the kind of work that goes into this and why it happened. So about 2019 or so, I wrote to the DEC with a grant opportunity to fund a study. This is a very expensive study that was undertaken. It involved many stakeholders, including this board, the consultants, Lisa Rickmers from H2M, Liz Moran from Ecologics, my board, Trustee Debbie Berenger, Trustee Andy Ferraro, Trustee John Carl, and Trustee Marty O'Connor, myself, as well as Supervisor Anthony Cardone and his councilwoman Mary Bingham. With us tonight, we have Department of Health from Orange County, Steve Gagnon. We appreciate your coming and all the work, Steve, you've done for us on this project. Thank you. So having said all that, we've tried to create a very robust project, and I think we've accomplished that thanks to the good works of both Liz and Lisa. So I'm going to pass this off at this time to Trustee John Carl.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Back in 2020, a aquatic vegetation survey was done on Monbassia Lake, and much of that came with the efforts of some of the residents that live on the lake. We had a group known as the Lower Hudson Prism Aquatic Invasive Strike Task Force, and that PRISM stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. They came on September the 21st, 2020. I had just gotten elected back to the village board. We met at one of the residents' houses up there. They went out, they did their survey, and it was a very thorough survey that was done on the different weeds that are in the lake, namely the water chestnut, which has become a real problem in a lot of lakes throughout the country. So the village, after this report was completed, we followed the best practice, the best management practices using the study and the recommendations of this report. What we wound up doing was purchasing an additional weed harvester. So we had 2 weed harvesters on that lake last summer, pretty much 35 to 40 hours per week running through the summer. This year, the 1 weed harvester was out of service for a little bit. The other weed harvester continued the entire summer, just finished up this past Friday. So with that, just to bring you up on this water chestnut and the issues that it does create if you do not remove it. And this is part of the report. The water chestnut is able to grow exponentially because each seed produces up to 12 rosettes, with each rosette containing up to 20 seeds. And just to go down, so I don't have to read the whole report to you, removing one plant before the seeds drop is the equivalent of removing 240 plants from appearing the following year. So the village has been very active trying to get this lake back into shape. We do have this year with the drought, the lake is down. The lily pads on the south part of the lake. We've tried to get in there with the harvester, with the lake being down. We were winding up stirring up the water. We didn't want to make the water too turbid, so we had to pull out of there, and we focused strictly on the water chestnut and not the lily pad as much. The lily pad can be dealt with. We do have a outside vendor that comes in by the name of Solitude. They have a airboat that comes in, and they put the copper sulfate into the water to help with the milfoil as well as the lily pads to an extent. And I think that brings us up to where we are since 2020.
Thank you, Trustee Carl, I appreciate it. We have with us also this evening Water Supervisor Ernie Mabey, who I'm just going to ask to briefly talk about the current conditions of the Monbassia Reservoir as well as well 4.
Thank you, Mayor. My name's Ernie. I run the Water Department for the Village of Monroe. I've been here 17 years. The village serves right around 12,500 people. We've got a couple of water districts that we sell water to in the town. Total is right around 3,000 service connections between the town and the village. The primary source of water is Monbassia Reservoir. Watershed is roughly 1,790 acres. I'm sorry, that's the whole watershed, not the lake. The lake is roughly 345 acres. Secondary water source is well number 4. That is located in Smith Clove Park between the park and Franklin Avenue. If you look on page, I believe it's I guess it's on page 3, the legend, you'll see the watershed from Monbassia Reservoir is outlined in red. You can see the reservoir inside that. The watershed actually goes into the town of Tuxedo just a little bit. It engulfs Kloiber's Pond there. If you're familiar with East Monbassia there, where it crosses the town of Tuxedo line, that's Kloiber's Pond there on the right. That runs into the reservoir through the woods. If you look over where well number 4 is, same thing. It's outlined in red. That is the source water area, protection area for our well number 4. You can see that goes basically around 17 or future 6, whatever you want to call it, over on the other side, which is the north side of 17, and it actually goes into the town of Palm Tree briefly. Do you want me to do? Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie and Neil and John. I'm Liz Moran from the consultant team, and the focus of our presentation tonight is really on protecting those areas that you just saw on the map, or that you can see in the map that's actually in your handout. So the Drinking Water Source Protection Plan is a way to prevent contaminants or pollutants from entering the water supply. So we heard that there's some efforts to prevent aquatic weeds, for example, within the reservoir. So also we're looking at the landscape, and those were the designations on the maps that you see. The watershed is the land area where rain and runoff flow into Monbassia Reservoir. And the designation around well 4 is this is the land area where water seeps through and reaches the drinking water supply. So that's really the focus of our efforts in the Drinking Water Source Protection Plan, and I'm going to describe in a little bit more detail what that is. But before I do that, I want to just highlight that this is not the first effort to kind of take a close look at the Monroe water supply and make sure that we are protecting it for future generations. So this timeline here that you see on the screen and in your handout show that the reservoir itself was constructed, the dam, the impoundment was created in 1894. So in the early 20th century, there were some watershed rules and regulations that New York State Department of Health has adopted for all water supplies. And they were very last century, right? They were things like how close can your privy be to the water supply, or what do you do with carcasses and things, in distances, setbacks. So there always has been a focus on what you do on the landscape can affect your water supply. But then again, as our understanding of contamination and hydrology and actual threats has evolved, so has our approach to what we do about drinking water protection. So you also see on this timeline that in 1999, the water treatment itself was upgraded with some sand filters, which help filter the water from Monbassia Lake before it is put into the distribution system. In 2002, New York State, well, in the early 2000s, this program lasted for several years. The state and regional planning agencies went through the state and looked at drinking water supplies kind of from a top-down perspective and saying, okay, based on this land use and the nature of this watershed, we think that these are potential sources of contamination that should be worried about. So, they identify things like runoff and development and farming and pesticides and herbicides, but it was just kind of a snapshot in time. It didn't have any proactive measures for recommending practices that would then be carried forward. So the Drinking Water Source Protection Plan is kind of the next generation of that, which we'll talk about. And then other activities on this timeline, the comprehensive plan, kind of land use planning from multiple perspectives: environmental perspectives, water quality perspectives, economic development, demographic planning, housing, all of those. Also from the perspective of what we do on the landscape can affect our water quality. So then in 2019, as the mayor and John both mentioned, New York State agencies came together: the DEC, the Department of Health, the Office of General Services, Department of Ag and Markets, other local health departments came together and decided that it was time to do a next generation for long-term protection of source water, and that unlike the SWAP, the Source Water Assessment Program in the early 2000s, this was going to be a much more stakeholder-driven, kind of community-based effort, and it was going to focus on implementation. Like, if we're making recommendations for the future, we want to put an institutional framework in place to ensure that those recommendations are actually captured and followed through. So that's what this plan is. The agencies came together and put forth what they call a draft framework, which is a recommendation for a program that could apply to all types of water supplies across the state. So surface waters like Monbassia Reservoir, and groundwater like your wells, and sole source aquifers, all kinds of streams, the whole gamut of water supplies that the people of New York rely on for their safe drinking water. So how can we put together a framework that will work for all the multitude of resources that we have, and also the great diversity of communities that we have? So that's the emphasis on the kind of the community stakeholder participation in this program. So we're going to talk a little bit about the steps of the framework, because the framework itself guides the development of our plan. So if you've seen the plan online or you have a chance to look at it, you'll see it follows a very stepwise process. And we're going to explain those steps and explain the major findings of those in relation to the Monroe system. But we're mostly going to focus on recommendations and next steps for implementation. So I mentioned that there are components of the framework, and here they are. There's 4 steps and then various stages within those steps. The first step is to bring everybody together in a stakeholder group and have them think about what do you want to see in the future for the Monroe water system and the public water supply. So goals and vision for that, and then this question of, well, where are we now, right? So what's the overview of the water system? So we engaged Ernie and his team to help with that, and then prepare that map that you saw earlier in your handouts. Look closely at what are the land uses and potential sources of contaminant or issues or development pressures on the lands that are contained within those maps. And then inventory that, and then putting that together and looking ahead into strategies. What do we do in the future to protect and implement actions and projects so that we actually reach that vision? And then the 4th step, which is very important, is how do we keep it going? What's a maintenance plan? How do we measure progress? How do we report progress back to the community? And who's in charge of that? And how do we ensure that there's continuity and kind of capture the institutional knowledge and everything that we learned putting together the Drinking Water Source Protection Plan? So our first task was to form that stakeholder group, and you've heard that it's really the town of Monroe, the supervisor, councilwoman, planning board, representatives of the village, Mayor Dwyer, as you know, Ernie from the treatment plant, trustees. Trustee Carl, I think, attended every single one of our monthly stakeholder group meetings, so that's been like 14 months that we've been seeing each other on our little computer screens. And also, we're happy that Steve Gagnon's here from Orange County, who's also been really helpful and a source of great information. So together, the stakeholder group worked to establish their goals and formulate the vision. And as I said, that informs us of, okay, where are we now, where do we want to go, and how do we get there? So these goals then that are listed here, these 6 goals really help us structure the recommendations and the implementation and strategies and priorities. So you'll see them listed here. You know, here's the vision, encompasses topics like understanding the source of the public water supply. So typically in many of the communities we work with, there's not a lot of deep understanding of where is the watershed. Where does the water come from that feeds the wells or drains into our reservoir? And how do we affect that with our activities on the landscape? So that is part of the vision for the future, that the community is knowledgeable and engaged and committed to that level of protection. And that as a result, the village continues to be able to deliver the high quality drinking water that meets current standards and will continue to do so. So from that vision, you see that the goals here, protecting public health, addressing existing water quality issues. You know, we heard some discussion of maintenance within the reservoir itself, education, as I said, treatment technology, making sure that as standards change or as water quality changes, that the drinking water infrastructure is able to continue to provide treatment, and figure out what's happening on the landscape and plan for that. So that was the goal and vision part. And so I'm going to turn this over to Lisa now to go through the second step of the framework, which is to kind of do the where are we now part, the current conditions.
So once the stakeholder group was formed and the vision identified, the next step was to actually assess the current conditions, to understand what the water supply consisted of, what current treatment existed, the infrastructure, how much water demand there was, and to review all the annual water quality reports. The technical team then worked to delineate the source water in critical areas for each of the area's watersheds, to evaluate current land use patterns over those source water in critical areas, and review the historical records and create an inventory of all potential contaminant sources in the source water in critical areas. And the following series of maps will show what that research revealed. So on the map that's on the screen, or if you're turning through your packet, you can see both of the source water areas here. The red line represents the source water area where the water will eventually make its way into either Mombasha Lake or well number 4. When you look at the primary source water for source of water for the community, that's Mombasha Lake, and you'll notice that the source water area stretches pretty wide around that. The topography means that it actually stretches pretty far to the west and north. You can take note of the source water intake. The intake of is that green star. And if you look at well number 4, you'll notice there's a lot of municipal lines, so it helps show the complexity of that watershed, which stretches across Curious Joel's boundaries, town of Monroe, as well as village of Monroe. And we can turn to the next. Slide shows the land uses over the Mombasha Lake Reservoir area, and helps to build a picture of what those uses are and what impacts they might have on the watershed. The bright yellow color is residential. The green is public spaces to the south and east there. And you'll notice right around the source water intake, there's a little bit of a commercial area as well. On this map, you can see a purple line, and that purple line represents the critical area. The critical area is the area in which the water moves much more quickly into the source water, into the Lake Mombasha, as opposed to the source water area, which is a longer trajectory of time. Sticking with the Mombasha Reservoir here, this map shows the potential contaminant sources that were identified. Our research showed 49 potential contaminant sources in the source water area, 44 of which were closed spills, so the majority of that. 29 potential contaminant sources in the critical area, 16 of which were closed spills. And it's notable that one of the potential contaminant sources in the source water area and 4 in the critical area were actually multiple location sources, so they're not represented by a point here. One of them being the transportation corridor, where runoff is a key concern, and another being failing septic systems. So those types of are not pinpointed to a specific location, but rather represent a potential contaminant source that has a series of locations. slide shows the potential contaminant sources in the well number 4 area. There are 28 identified potential contaminant sources, 6 in the source water area, 6 of which were closed spills, and 4 in the critical area, 3 of which were closed spills. Again, there was 1 in the source water area and 3 in the critical area that were multi-location potential contaminant sources, including the roadway that runs right through the watershed there. Once they had identified where the watersheds actually lied, what land uses were overlaid the watershed, and what potential contaminant sources existed within the watershed, the stakeholder group was able to then move on to identifying their priority issues. And the very first of the priority issues identified as part of this DWSB2 report was intermunicipal awareness, collaboration, and enforcement. As you saw from all those maps, the source water area extends across municipal boundaries for both water sources. From Mbeisha, the source water area is largely in the town of Monroe, but a small portion is actually in the town of Tuxedo. And in well 4, the source water area extends into Curious Joel, the town of Monroe, and the village of Monroe. So collaboration and shared enforcement is important in the watershed, particularly in the areas of salt storage for de-icing roads, which represents a large threat to the watershed, as well as collaboration on residential and commercial development. The goal for this priority issue is to enhance municipal cooperation and collaboration to advance the best practices and improve emergency response within the watersheds. A second priority issue is managing existing development. Failing septic systems, commercial and residential chemical use are all existing risks to the source water area, and the goal here is to promote best practices and reduce nutrients entering the water body. Third priority issue focused on future development. With new development, there comes new risks, new potential contaminant sources. So there's a need for appropriate regulations and the possibility of designating a critical environmental area over the water, within the source water area that would mandate that any state environmental quality review projects take into account the source water area when they are considered as part of the seeker process. The goal with this priority issue is to develop appropriate development regulations and that prioritize water protection. A fourth priority issue was to enhance the management of regulated potential contaminant sources. There are regulated potential contaminant sources in the form of chemical storage and oil storage that appropriate regulation and monitoring can prevent future spills and prevent this from becoming a problem for the watershed. Fifth identified priority was erosion. This is particularly related to Mbeisha Reservoir, where on the south side, runoff from dirt roads can cause turbidity in the water and presents risks. The goal of this priority issue is to decrease the risk of erosion through managing the shoreline, dealing with dirt roads, possibly increasing areas of plantings to create a vegetated buffer for the reservoir. And a final priority issue identified, which really extends throughout all of them, is outreach and education. Oftentimes, business and homeowners aren't aware of their location within the source water or critical area or how their actions might be impacting their drinking water supply. So this goal is to increase education and awareness and empower business and homeowners to protect their own water source.
Okay, so how are we going to do that? How are we going to make all of these recommendations come to fruition? That's the fourth step of the framework, and it has to do with implementation and monitoring progress. So the first element is to designate a plan management team. So as I mentioned, you know, with changing personnel, you have a plan that needs to be kind of a living document so that as conditions change on the landscape, as demographics change, as, you know, water quality standards change over time, the plan management team is going to be tasked with keeping an eye on all of that. So the plan management team, the bullets on this slide say it's responsible for managing, also for reporting. So there's an annual reporting requirement back to the Department of Health and DEC, the regulatory agencies, but also with the community. So kind of an enhancement of the annual drinking water quality report that goes out to the communities each year. It would be, how are we doing with our DWSP2 program? And also, the agencies are really encouraging communities to re-examine and update/revise as necessary their plan on a regular basis. Maybe tied with updates to a comprehensive plan, so a timetable of maybe 5 years or so, depending on kind of where you are in your comprehensive plan cycle. So that's what the team is tasked with, and based on our conversations among our stakeholder group, we think that kind of people who would be key to being part of this team are listed here. So you have village elected officials, appointed officials, staff, from multiple municipalities, because if you saw the way the watersheds lie, they cross municipal boundaries. So we also included on here the Orange County Department of Health. As I said, they've been really instrumental. And looking ahead, the Department of Health will continue to be a resource for the DWSP2s. Also on here is the MUDNA Joint Sewer Commission, because, you know, the issue of septic management and wastewater management is important. So make sure that that is kind of integrated into consideration of what's going on in the watershed. So, and then Conservation Commission. There may be priority areas that should be considered for some type of conservation easement or protections that would ultimately help provide some additional protection to the drinking water supply in the future. I should mention here that one of the advantages for communities for adopting a DWSP2, a drinking water source protection plan, is access to funding sources. So for example, acquisition of key parcels that are conservation oriented, or support with planning initiatives, and also support with just maintenance of the water supply and reservoir infrastructure themselves. Having an adopted plan puts the community in a competitive advantage for state funding programs for this. So there's a lot of advantages, kind of near-term and long-term, for going through this program. So what happens next? Near term, the village board, the trustees will consider a resolution to adopt the plan once it's final. It'll be final when we get a letter from the state agency saying that it is final. So we expect that to happen shortly. And then the plan management team will convene and start to consider what their work plans and priorities are and develop their implementation strategy. And as I note in this slide, there is a continuing resources available to the village through the technical assistance providers. So Lisa and I are both on the Barton and LaJudas team of technical assistance providers that the New York State is funding. And they are looking at a 6-month extension of that contract with Barton and LaJudas, just to help each of the communities get started, to make sure that all of these maps and databases and knowledge that we've gathered over the past 14 months gets appropriately transferred and maintained, and kind of can look ahead. And then ongoing, I mentioned the requirement for annual progress reports and periodic updates, and Department of Health has added staff positions statewide in their organization that will be tasked specifically with assisting municipalities with their drinking water source protection plans. So you're not left alone once this plan is adopted. And the whole framework, one of the key components of the DWSP2 is this concept of adaptive management, that, we have to expect new challenges to arise. Regulations, certainly, emerging contaminants, land use, but invasive species. And then this final bullet here, I think, has kind of came home to many of our municipalities over this past year, which is impacts of a changing climate. So these periods of extended drought interspersed with very intense rain events are very challenging to manage in terms of runoff and erosion control. So, there has to be a continued focus on how we can protect our water resources. So that is the end of our presentation, and now I think the mayor is going to moderate Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate it. Great presentation by all. I appreciate all the work that went into this. It's very serious work that we do. We do have many people who obviously are part of the system insofar as drinking the water, and that's very, very serious work, bottom line. I do have just a couple of quick comments. I think it was Lisa pointed out, or Liz had pointed out, about what we know about where contaminants were sourced, what we know about where we've had issues. And that's exactly the point, what we know. There may be other areas where we don't know, and this plan will help us to implement those. So maybe it's an inventory of everybody's septic system, their solids, their liquids, where their oil tanks are, how do they heat their home. All those pieces help to create a compliance for us so that we know who is in that watershed area. We have, if you look at the watershed area, it seems to be heavy on the northwest, and that's because it's way above the lake. So everything is running downhill. And again, for that very reason, as runoff and so forth comes, so comes whatever it ran over. So if it's nutrients, if it's fertilizer, if it's any spillage on your property, whatever it may be, it's all coming down to the lake. And that's what makes it so critical for us. I think that's all I really had, but it was important. I wanted you to know that it's what we know currently right now. What was programmed here is what's been documented, and documented only to the Department of Health and so forth, DEC. Having said that, I'd like to open this up to the public. Steve, did you have anything you'd like to mention at all? Thank you, I appreciate it. Steve Gagnon. Thank you. So again, I mentioned right in the beginning the presentation, and everyone has a copy of this for this evening. And anybody that has any questions about this document and about what was spoken about tonight, you're welcome to come on up. Just give us your name, and we'll take your name, and then we'll have an opportunity for you to speak. Please. I just have you speak closer to the mic, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
On the last slide, I saw that you mentioned emerging contaminants as a key topic. I'm wondering, with regard to neighboring municipalities and water districts, including Harriman, they have detected exceedances or noteworthy concentrations of PFOS and uranium. And I'm just wondering if there's a contingency plan in terms of for detected in.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah, I guess I can take that one. We've been testing for PFOAs and PFAS for, I believe it's 2 or 3 years now, Steve? The first year that it was on our sampling schedule, it was pretty involved. I believe it was every 4 months, so that would be three times a year. And to those who are, I'm not a professional in PFOAs, I just sample, take it to a lab, sign my name to that, and then Mr. Gagnon over there gets the results. And at the end of the day, Orange County makes our sampling schedule every year. That's not up to me. It's up to me to follow it, or else we will be in violation. We've actually been, it's started 3 years ago, and the numbers are on the low side. Are they present? Very, very, very low. Low enough to where our sampling schedule got reduced to once a year. So if that, hopefully that helps. It's way below the MCL level.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Larry O'Neill. I live at 8 Riley Road in the town of Monroe, and nobody sees more activity at the water plant than me. I live directly next door to it. 6:20 in the morning, when the gentleman who does the invasives comes in and starts everything up, my dog barks like crazy. So thank you for that. I also I asked Tony Cardone and some of the town board members what jurisdiction the town has, the village has, over the town with regard to these topics, and I have not received a reply yet, so I'm looking forward to that, Tony, if you're still in the room. I did want to know for that funding that's available, if we are being asked to retrofit or do any type of remediation type work to our properties, does that cover any funding for us as individuals? Because, well, okay, I'll just leave it at that. That's a question. And then just one last question, and I'll just listen to the answers. You mentioned that there's a meeting tomorrow. What is that meeting for? What is the intention of it?
So it's a regularly scheduled Board of Trustee meeting, and on the agenda there are 3 public hearings and the business of the village.
That has to do with the recreation use on it?
It has to do with a public hearing on the local law, rescinding a local law.
Allowing recreation on the lake.
Well, it doesn't allow. What it does is an opportunity to come in. Back in 2011, a law was created to allow folks to come in and apply for it. Yes.
So has there been any proof that the recreation on the lake is causing any of the contamination? Because I can tell you, again, living next door, you guys bring more vehicles and more things into that lake than anybody on the north side, and it's not even close. You also have excavators that reach their bucket into the water sometimes to get some of the invasives that have fallen back in. So I think we want to be real careful about where we tread here, because these invasives are not only introduced by the residents in the area. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Thank you.
My name is Andrew Lawrence. I'm with Friends of Walton Lake, which is outside the area that we're talking about. I firmly believe that the best protection to any water source is open space preservation. I was under the understanding until yesterday that the village of Chester, the village of Monroe, and the town of Monroe were in a coordinated discussion about how to bring the 3 water systems together. As you know, village of Chester uses Walton Lake as their sole source water supply. There's about 4,000 people, and we've been working with them for a couple of years. And we thought there was something going, but I found out yesterday, on Sunday, that there wasn't. So I'd like to I spoke to the Chester folks today, and they would like to put themselves, the Village of Chester, the water supply superintendent, would like to put Chester in this mix, if it were possible, seeing 3 municipalities more powerful than just 2 municipalities. Particularly with the fact that there's a bond issue coming out of the state, $4.2 billion for open space, possible open space preservation. Monbassia Lake is not part, as far as I know, of the Federation of Lake Associations, which is a New York State organization that Walton Lake is part of, that has these great meetings on a regular basis that lays stuff out. You can see stuff you never even thought about, not just on the grant side, but on the harmful algal bloom side as well. So there was a Zoom call today with the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. I'll be quick. They have 800 acres in the town of Monroe. They are willing to broaden what they're trying to do and to broaden the park area that would seriously, positively affect Lake Monbassia. In addition to the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, there's Arrow Park, there's the Appalachian Trail, where the first piece of the Appalachian Trail is Monroe, down in Arden, and we also have Sterling Forest. So these are issues that are broader than us that we can really play part in and hook up with these folks and get the water source protection that we really need for Lake Monbassia. And I thank you for this meeting.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else from the public?
Hi, John Donlin. I live at 34 Hain Drive. So my question is, I thought today's meeting was going to be about what tomorrow's vote is on, and you were about to explain it, and I think it has to do with recreation, and I didn't see that very much in this presentation. Could you explain to me what's being voted on tomorrow?
That'll be tomorrow. What we're discussing tomorrow in a public hearing first is the local law that was enacted in 2011 and the concerns that the Village of Monroe has today reflecting that local law, which gave the opportunity to have a watercraft on the lake, certain type, with a permit from the superintendent of the highway department or the DPW back in 2011. Fast forward through today, and we don't really believe that that's the model that needs to happen. So we're going to have a discussion tomorrow in that regard, and that's a public hearing. So everybody that would like to come and speak about that is able to do that tomorrow, and then we'll have a discussion as well.
You don't believe?
This board doesn't, no.
Or doesn't believe going the wrong way?
No, the board doesn't at this time believe that the 2011 law, which was never implemented nor ever asked for in permitting, we have nothing on it. We only became aware of it. Somebody had actually brought it to our attention back in, I think, 2019. I wasn't even aware it existed.
So it's a law that exists that allows for recreational watercraft usage. Let me finish. Watercraft usage once a permit has been established?
Yes, sir.
And you want to get rid of that law?
We want to rescind that law. That's what's out for public discussion right now.
That's the vote tomorrow?
Whether it's a vote or not, I can't say. It's open for public hearing and discussion.
That probably should have been discussed.
Well, that's,
Okay.
you know.
And I have another separate question. Thank you for answering that one.
Yep.
In terms of the environmental study that talks about like waste going into the lake, so I represent 300 feet of the residential lake space with my wife and 2 young children. And so we have a septic, and that was well-crafted and approved and functions as is. So there isn't any waste, from my view, going into the lake where we live. But I also share that backyard with hawks, deer, bear, raccoon. I could go on, probably about 50 or 60 different species on our property. And they use that backyard for their bathroom. And it's basically a cliff. It's all sheetrock where I live, and it slopes down to the water.
Sure.
And all of that goes into the water. So I'm just, from my perspective, being a resident with, and I go down there every day, there's quite a bit of animal waste that's going into the water. And I didn't see that mentioned in the report.
Thank you. discuss that at all? Is it something attributable tonight, or?
You're right that there are natural sources of fecal material and, animal waste that in the reservoir through runoff. That's true, but we, in our scope, we didn't try to quantify kind of the relative magnitude of the natural sources versus the density of septics. But that might be something that the plan management team would take on as an analysis.
Well, if we're making, significant decisions about what happens to the residences around the reservoir, that's a huge omission and needs to be taken into account before we start making, significant decisions about how the residents use their backyards. That's it.
Thank you.
Comito, I have a question on the potential contaminants. How far is it from the water line? Is it feet, miles?
So in the report itself, we do have the actual potential contaminant source inventory with latitude and longitude when we are able to pinpoint a location. And we'd need to, if there's a particular one you want to look at, we'd have to look at that report to pull this up. This is our best approximation, zoomed out with the sources shown as effectively as we could to give you a sense of this. But that longitudinal and latitudinal data is in the contaminant source inventory.
The reason for my question is because I would say more than 80% of the people who are here are Mambesha Lake residents, front water owners. Am I right? And I am so happy that it's not around us and it's above us. That means we're doing a great job.
I would also just point out that most of those potential contaminant sources represent spills that were identified, and then hopefully most of them closed as well. So and I'm not saying that you're not doing a fantastic job, you very likely are, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to pinpoint something from your houses unless there was an actual registered spill at the site. Just to be clear on what that's representing.
Honestly, I understand it because we were the group of people who initiated this in 2019. We love, our houses are in the town of Mambesha, but our hearts are in the reservoir of Mambesha. Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Chevalier. I just have a few quick questions. The lake supplies 12,500 people at this point in time. What's the max? And has that been taken into consideration as to how much water the lake has, and what's the upper limit?
The plant in the current iteration right now has the ability to process 1.5 million gallons per day. We're at 1.2 to 1.3 right now, and we have 3 significant projects in the village coming online soon. So that is what the plant currently is capable of working on per day.
Okay, so maybe 20,000 people, ultimately? I mean, it's hard to say, right?
It's really hard to say, even the 12,500. So tonight we mentioned that we bill out 3,000 water accounts.
Right.
Of the 3,000 we bill out, 5 of them are in town accounts. Of the 5, there's probably in excess of 150 homes, maybe 200 homes on the town side. I'm not even sure how many are in each district. They have a master meter. That master meter then feeds town-owned residences. So we don't even have the ability to quantify. Here in the village, we have over 9,000 residents. So we threw out a number that we thought really kind of reflected that times 3.
When you take your water samples, is that from the lake or is it after the processing at the water plant?
That all depends with what's on the sampling schedule. Like, the main thing is coliform. I do coliform, total coliform, E. coli every single week. That's usually from 3 or 4 different locations throughout the village.
That's after the treatment?
Yes, that's filtered, chlorinated water from the distribution system.
Okay. The only other thing that I thought would be appropriate, your plan management team, it would be nice to include one of the residents or a liaison from residents who are on the lake itself.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Marianne Bischoff. I'm also from Nettie Fred Cooperative Corporation, 40 Water Plant Road with Steve Chevalier. So I had a few quick technical questions. I was wondering what percentage of the lake is fed by springs and what percentage is rainfall?
I guess, I don't know, I mean, you're talking about what's entering, I don't know that there's a great distinction.
Well, if I could answer something, maybe it could put some light on it. So, due to the current drought we have right now, the lake has dropped as much as 28 inches below the spillway. Now, if we're managing right now with a mandatory restriction currently in place, we're still coming up with 1 to 1.1 million gallons of processed water per day. That means that we're not replenishing, so the spring-fed water is probably not doing what we think it's doing. But the runoff from the top water, the water that comes from all the shed areas and fills into the lake, whether it's through the property owner's property downhill of it or from the upper elevations, that is where I think a lot of it comes from. I mean, right now, I think we're at what level?
Minus 24.
So we're at minus 24. We were at minus 24 a month ago, and we've had probably 4 or 5 rain events, some maybe more significant than others, but really nothing of consequence that would bring that level back up. I mean, everybody that lives on the lake sees the water level has diminished quite a bit. So it's not replenishing, which is a concern for me. And I think a lot of it is top heavy insofar as the shed area is concerned, which then brings in the nutrients, it brings in the natural occurring fecal matter, it brings in all the other pieces that run from the top in.
I read on some reports, I think from the village website, maybe I went back and looked at different reports, and it said that it's primarily spring-fed. So I wasn't really trying to make an argument about runoff or not. I was just wondering about the quantity
Sure, yeah.
of the water, because everything since been there since I was born, and my grandfather's been there since the late 40s, and we always thought of the lake as primarily spring-fed. So I was just wondering, but I guess that's not known. I know it's hard to calculate.
There are 3 springs that feed that, and in the wintertime, you'll see that's the last areas of that lake that freeze up. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but there's 3 separate areas, and they are the springs that also contribute to that.
Around
to
the
that
edges?
lake. Not around the edges, it's
In
out.
the very middle?
They're down towards the southern part of the reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
There's 3 separate areas that, and they're almost perfectly round, and then they freeze over last because they're taking the warmer water from the ground and it's coming up. So.
And I'm wondering, seems kind of important to know where the main sources are coming from, because where are the contaminants coming from? This wasn't really going to be a question, but along those lines, you show the area around well 4 as if the rainfall and the runoff is going down into the well, but aquifers travel miles, so there could be water feeding. There's most likely 100% water feeding well 4 that has nothing to do with the rain that's falling on top of it.
That's correct, and we had that map was developed by our project hydrogeologists who actually did kind of some modeling of subsurface flow. So that's just not, here's the rain that soaks in. It actually does look at the topography, the nature of the soils, the nature of the, aquifer materials, its porosity, and figure out the time of travel that water would take to get to that
And where the
well.
sources are? Because, it could come from a mile away, and there
Oh,
could be
yeah,
a source
yeah,
a mile away
yeah.
that's problematic.
But then the map shows the distance that has I think it's a 10-year travel time to reach the actual wellhead. So it's true that, groundwater does move on a more regional basis. And that also gets back to your question about the springs, is that when we're in these periods of extended drought, the groundwater table itself also drops. So maybe that's why we're not seeing the amount of replenishment, as the mayor noted, that as it's been so dry this summer, that the reservoir is dropping.
Right.
So, yeah.
Thanks. And then about the spills, I looked online on the village website for the 2021 water report, and every contaminant that was listed, it was negative, meaning that it was below the amount that would be problematic. And it shows really, it's a nice report, it shows where the contaminant could come from, and it does show the testing was either at well 4 or at the filtration site. I don't know if you call it filtration or treatment plant. So just like you're saying there's spills and everything, but it kind of comes across like we already have a current problem. Like I get that you're saying we could have future problems with development and all that, but I don't see the current data that says we have like a contamination problem right now.
Yes, we would agree with that. Part of our task was to kind of inventory what is known, what are in the state and federal databases of closed spills and such. And as Lisa said, most of them have presumably been remediated. But we want to keep them on the map so that if something pops up in the future, the plan management team will have that resource to go back to that map and the specific latitude and longitude and try to figure out what's potentially going on. But it's true. I mean, you have excellent water quality, and the focus of this plan is to keep it that way. So it's really focused on prevention. It's not saying that we need to do any kind of remediation. It's really a tool to help us look ahead and plan.
I had another technical question, but since you're on that, one of the remediations is to stop the boating. I don't remember how it was put in the report, but I flipped through it. So is there contamination from boats, from boating, from recreational use of the lake, or is that not something you guys looked at?
Well, most reservoirs have restricted recreational use, restrictions on the type of motors, the size of the motors, the speed, the number, the access, because it is a potential risk. And then if boats go from one lake to another, there's the possibility of introduction of invasive species as well.
So the contaminants could be from gas motors or invasive species coming in, but right now there's not contamination that you guys measured from boats.
We did not do any particular measurements for this report. We analyzed existing data and spoke with, local knowledge, local experts on that.
Okay, great. I'll be super quick. So the dirt road surprised me. At my permanent house, I have a dirt road, and I don't want to, I have a dirt, it's a dirt road, but a dirt driveway, and I don't want to tar it over because I don't want it to go into the well. So I would think dirt roads would be better than if we blacktopped over the dirt roads. Wouldn't that cause more like runoff, the water lands, and then it moves more quickly, and then you're also getting all the hydrocarbons from that? I was just wondering, what's the issue with the dirt roads? What seeps into the water from dirt roads that's problematic?
Silt and sediment. It's a big problem down on the south side of Monbassia Lake. It's silting up, and a lot of it's from runoff.
The south side is by the gatehouse where you
No,
guys
the
have?
south side is down towards Tuxedo, on the Tuxedo side, down West Monbassia.
Okay, west. Okay.
That's a lot of that lake is silting up down there. There's a lot of private roads across West Monbassia up in the back, and when it rains, it's very turbid water that
And the
enters
silt,
the reservoir down there, and a couple of other areas as well.
So the silt is a contaminant, or it kills the fish, or?
Well, it is, yeah, it is certainly a contaminant.
Okay.
And I would just add here that, the report was really looking, didn't necessarily recommend paving dirt roads, but rather maintaining them and restoring them, addressing issues of slope stabilization and increasing vegetation and riparian buffers so that siltation doesn't run into the lake.
Okay, great. And the last question or point is, you guys mentioned that sort of the prevailing wisdom from all these different bodies, like the DEC, is to have community involvement. So wouldn't it make sense to have people who are around the lake, living around the lake, loving it, caring it, wanting to take care of it, to be on the stakeholder group? Like, isn't that, I guess I'm really asking because you're more in touch with the state agencies, like the DEC and stuff. So when they say community involvement, wouldn't that include the people right around the water body or whatever the natural resources that you're trying to protect?
I think that would be correct.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And
Thank you so much.
I found it very difficult to hear tonight, so I'm going to speak right into the microphone here.
Can I have your name, please, first? Thank you.
Okay, my name is Brandon Russell. I live at 12 Lakeview Drive in Monroe. One of the questions I have is about the weed harvester. My initial observation of that was in the ponds in the town of Monroe. So one of the questions I would have, knowing that when you reference the state, they have particular procedures for all of the state reservoirs, and one of those procedures involves the state approving state-approved steam cleaning facilities before that boat is allowed on the water. So a logical question to me would be, does the town or the village of Monroe or the town of Monroe have a procedure that they're following to clean the harvester when it goes from the town onto Lake Monbassia?
Yes.
And what does that involve?
It's power washed and with a solution, 1 to 10 bleach. The thing is power washed down at the DPW prior to it going up onto the reservoir.
Has that always been the case?
Yes.
Since when?
Since we've been moving the harvester from one pond to the other, it always gets cleaned and disinfected before it goes on the
Okay,
public
well,
wastewater.
the state, from what I'm aware, uses steam cleaners. The big difference between steam at 212 and, an arbitrary with bleach. There's also a huge amount of areas on a harvester where there's potential contaminants to reside and get transferred. So I'm not suggesting that the contaminants might have come from the town of Monroe, but it's a possibility. And so I think that is one thing to consider while we're talking about the possible contamination sources. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, one more question. Again, John from 34 Hain Drive. So with respect to the not allowing the permits for a recreation craft, one of the concerns I have is that a lot of the times I have people coming from elsewhere on the lake onto my property for the day to enjoy the day on the rocks, and I'm constantly having to ask them to move on because I'm liable if something were to happen to them on the property. And my concern is always that, when I hear children down there, that something might happen and I would have to rescue somebody in that situation. And that would require a craft more than likely in order to sort of, if something bad were to happen on the property. And again, if something does bad happen that's on my property, if I can't prove that I have adequate signage on my property, I'm going to be held liable for anything bad, and things can go very bad, and I'm not comfortable with that. And so
Not comfortable with what? I'm sorry.
with not being able to have a craft that would assist in safety, right? So apart from recreation, we're not really talking about having a craft for safety. And again, I have concerns. There are people on the reservoir, whether we like it or not, and they might be on my property or touching my property. If something happens to them and there's a distress, I can't get to them. I won't have a craft that's I'm able to put into the water and to save them.
Just so I understand, you're here on the top of the cliff, and the person's down here at the water?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Sure. So really, I can be anywhere on the property, right? The fact is that somebody that I don't know is
Has
on the
fallen
property.
down and in.
They're on the property, jumping off the rocks into the water.
Sure.
They fall, hit their head, pass out in the water. I need to save them. I'm the first one there, and I don't have a boat to get at them. So now I'm swimming or whatever. So I think, recreation.
911, Lakeside Fire Department, as well as Monbassia has boats, and they would be responding with them. That's part of their protocol.
Of course, but I mean, we're talking about life or death situation,
Stan?
and time matters. There's kids that are on the lake, all the time, and that's my responsibility. So if you're going to stop me from responding to that crisis, they're going to sue me. Who am I going to sue?
Well, I think that's a conversation we can have at another time. I understand your concern about liability.
But if you're going to take away if you're going to take away the craft, the ability to get a permit for the craft on the lake, you're taking away my ability to potentially save a life.
And I understand that, and I'd have to probably quantify it in where you actually live, where the cliff is, where these people are that do come in illegally onto your property or ours, and then have an injury. That's a lot of sequential events that we need to understand what they are. You'd have to be there. You'd have to recognize that something has occurred, right? Because I would imagine you would allow them on your property to have an incident. I think, like you said, you ask them to move on. So that's the first line of defense. Now, assuming that they ignore you and then fall and injure themselves, how would you respond? That's the question, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of. I mean, I wouldn't put it that way. I'm aware. I live there, so this is my backyard.
Sure.
So I know if somebody's in my backyard.
Right.
And so the fact of whether or not I'm there or not, I actually don't think that matters. Even if I'm not there, if somebody hurts themselves on my property, I'm liable for that.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that the liability aspect of it, somebody has illegally entered your property and signage is not located. Well, that's what
Sure.
you had mentioned, people
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So we're trying to figure out who's liable. Most likely, it's the deepest pockets, which most likely will be the Village of Monroe regardless. I'm sure that suit will come in your name and ours as well. But notwithstanding that, that's rhetorical and that's just semantics. We're trying to get into something about this and your concerns about having a watercraft that should, when, if necessary, you can make that response. A lot of things have to align in that environment. I appreciate what you're saying, but to Trustee Carl's point, we're actually looking at a watercraft for the village's purposes, for that purpose, both in enforcement and in for liability for people on the lake, i.e. ice fishing and things like that, because we don't know who's out there. And that's what all these stewards out here were about when we first brought this conversation up. So I don't want to get stuck in the weeds over that. I truly don't. I think that's tomorrow night. I really want to address this. We're just about 3 minutes out of our deadline.
I understand. It's a law.
But we definitely...
we can talk about any scenario we want, but
Yeah.
the law is, and you can all research this tonight.
Sure.
If something happens on that person's property, they're liable for it. End of discussion.
End of discussion. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it is 7:12. We have 3 minutes. If somebody else wants to speak, that'd be terrific. But at 7:15, come on up, sir. And I appreciate everybody's time this evening. Good.
Joshua Davies, Cooper Drive in the Village. What percentage from our filtered water to our billable water are we losing in the system?
Back in, I believe it was January, with the help of New York Rural Water Association and their underground leak detection program, we did find 4 large leaks that, in my opinion, have been going on for quite some time. So That was back in January. When this year's over, I will do a full evaluation of gallons lost. And I'm not a betting man, but the percentages, they will be a lot better than they were in 2021. 2021, I believe it was roughly 20%, 20%, which is high. I've been here 17 years, and I've seen it as tight as like 93%. I don't know if it's that tight now. It could be, but it's for sure the percentage of losses will be better 2022 than they were 2021.
Another question, with the enforcement, we're in a water restriction right now. Is there any way with the Wi-Fi meters that you guys can tell when, somebody is
That Wi-Fi meter you're referring to simply could be somebody using water inside their home. Everything comes out at a certain gallon per minute rate, right? So it doesn't discriminate, is it outside, is it inside environment.
how are we enforcing violations?
It's a physical environment. So today, just this morning actually, we found somebody watering their lawn, knocked on the door, no one was home, took pictures of the event, and we wrote a violation today and sent it out by certified mail.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, again, I want to thank everyone for their attendance and their attention and their courtesy here. We appreciate it. To Mary Ann Bischoff's point, when we do go into the next phase of this work, there will be a committee put together, and we will see to it that there is somebody from the lake community on that table. I appreciate that. Thank you. Have a great night.